All right, what I'd like to show you now is a document I put together for you to help guide you as you are working on any lesson plan. So we talked about the basic lesson plan components that we are going to find on virtually any lesson plan. So I have them here for you. This may be something you'd like to make a copy of and just take a quick look at each time you do a lesson just to make sure you have all of your important components. But more than that, I have differentiated it for you so you have three different options. This is just the nutshell, the basic lesson plan checklist with each of the components just simply listed. But what I did to make this extra informative is I have more information on the second checklist where we have some descriptors, and then on the third checklist even more detail. So as you can see here, I have it broken down for you of what exactly you are to do with each of the different components. So what I'd like to do is just go through this with you. And as we do that, I will start with determining the grade level and content area. And hopefully you took a look at the last video where we navigated KSDE and we took a look at how to look up your grade level and your content area to find your standard, and how to take a look at that standard and how to break down that standard and find that piece that you're ready to teach. So once you have your grade level, so kindergarten, first, second, third, fourth, whatever it is, then the content area would be the math, the ELA, it could be your science, social studies, whatever it is, you would put that here. And then you would align to the standards, and you'd need to list that standard here. And once you do that, this is where it gets a little bit trickier. Once you know what you want your students to learn and be able to do by the end of your lesson, that will be your objective. But how are you going to make sure? That will be your evaluation. It's easiest the first time you do this to break it apart, and then you need to put it together. Our objective and evaluation, they need to come together. So again, what do you want your students to know how to do or be able to do as a result of the lesson? And how will you measure and make sure that they can do it? Now you need to use some kind of a verb. They need to be doing something that you can actually see them doing. And I have some little notes here along the way to point out that these do need to be written together. All right. Materials, that's pretty easy to consider all of the physical items you're going to need for your lesson to be successful. Sometimes teachers don't think about needing a display table at the front of the room. So think of everything. Think of even the cleanup supplies and everything you possibly can need. You want to have all of that ready before your lesson even begins, so you don't have to stop and grab things during your lesson. You want it to go smoothly and effortlessly, so you can have more time to concentrate on your actual content and your students. All right. My favorite part of the lesson is the anticipatory set. This is the hook. This is how you are getting your students' attention for the lesson at hand. So the A set is the nickname for this particular component, is whatever it is that's going to cause them to be prepared for learning. So sometimes a teacher may come in costume to go along with that lesson that they're teaching. That is more of an extreme A set. Sometimes the teacher may just ask an intriguing question to pull the students in, and it gets them thinking, and that can be a great A set too. Sometimes it may be some kind of a prop at the front of the room that goes along with the lesson, or even a book. Imagine a picture book just propped up in front of the room, and the students know that this has something to do with the lesson. And again, it's getting their attention. All right, the next part is the introduction. The introduction is just short and sweet. This is where the teacher simply states the objectives and tells the students what they're about to learn. The teacher is, during this part, to get right to the point. It's similar to a title where you're just saying, today we will be learning how to whatever it is. So in this case, today we will be learning how to identify the main character of a story. Boom, that's it. We don't want to start teaching yet. We're just saying this is what we're going to be learning. And the teaching begins right here at the introduction stage. This is where you script out every part of your lesson, as if you had a substitute teacher come in, that person could take over that lesson and do it just how you planned. If you do it right, you will have every detail listed. This is several paragraphs in length. So when you are turning in a lesson plan, a formal lesson plan for one of your professors, always go back and double check that you've got that instruction as your longest piece where you write out everything that you need to say. And then third checklist, I will get into detail about what can make up the instruction. But right now, I'm going to talk to you about gradual release of responsibility. This is where the teacher does the demonstration, the I do. So the I is teacher. I am going to do it. And as you can see below, there will be a we do, and that means the students and the teachers together. And then finally, the you do is where they do this on their own. I'm also going to point out here that the teacher instruction and the check for understanding, they go together. So as the teacher starts instructing and telling about the lesson, they give a description, a background of whatever it is, the skill that they are imparting to their students. They will give lots of examples. And then once all of the information has been communicated to the students, then the teacher needs to make sure that they are understanding the information that they've received. So before the teacher can move on, the teacher needs to check. It's just like the title says, check for understanding. How are you going to make sure the students understand the skill? This can be done by having some kind of a check. Sometimes teachers will have some kind of a signal, and the students may put 3 fingers up if they fully understand, 2 if they think they have a general idea, and 1 if they don't understand at all. Sometimes teachers will have a dry erase board. Imagine if you're doing math and you've just introduced a new skill, and you have your students practice a problem, and then they hold up their answer for you to see. That's a quick way to pool many students to find out if they're understanding. And if they're all holding up the wrong answer, you know it's time for you to reteach, to go back to the beginning of your instruction and do it again, and use some new examples this time, and break it down even further. But most of the time, they are understanding, and you may have a few students who maybe didn't get it, but then you go back and you will say, okay, let's go through this problem together and let me talk about how I got this answer, or how most of us got this answer. And then those few that didn't understand it the first time or made a mistake go, oh, that's what I did, and they can correct themselves. But this is when a teacher decides, okay, now that I have gone through several minutes of this lesson, and now we've checked for understanding, are we ready to move on? I've done it, we've done it together, now it's time for them. When it is time for this part, this is when we have what we call the application, where they apply what they just learned, and they have their independent practice. So they're trying this on their own. This can also be where they're working with a partner. That can happen sometimes too. And once they do that, the teacher, of course, will give the directions, the students will practice the skill, and there will need to be some kind of a measurement so the teacher can ensure that the students understand it and can move on. It's back to that 80%. Some teachers will use 75%, some will use 85%. Sometimes they need to add this number of whatever it is that they're learning. But it needs to be measurable. Something needs to be counted, so you will know if your students are ready to build on that skill or if you need to reteach. Okay, so the you do. This is where they are doing the skill on their own. At the end of the lesson, it's time to recap. This is where you restate the introduction, you give a quick summary. So today we learned XYZ, and that means this and this and this. And then tell your students how they're going to use the skill again in the future. And it's an invitation for them to know. Sometimes kids think that just because they learn something new, that's the only time they'll ever use it. They don't think about the fact that they're learning this so they can use it again in the future. So be sure to let them know how that can happen. And then with all lessons, you want to think about differentiated instruction. That's just taking your lesson that you have and what modifications or adjustments do you need to make to best meet the needs of all students. So for example, if you have students writing, let's say a summary of a paragraph of something that they just learned, you may have a student who has a broken wrist and they can't write. So a modification for them could be that they could say orally, they could tell you the summary out loud, and that could count for their assessment, for their practice. So you may have a modification for a student who struggles in that particular subject, and that may mean making a modification, which means possibly fewer problems. Maybe they will be working with a paraprofessional. Maybe they'll have a completely different sheet to work on or activity to work on that best suits their learning needs. So it really depends on the situation and the student. If you have a student who is an English language learner, you may need to have an activity that has more pictures, and maybe they need support in a different way with more simplified directions, or maybe even working one-on-one with that student would be a form of differentiation. But whatever you do, you always want to plan your lesson for the majority of your students and then make the slightest adjustment possible. And if that works, then stick with the slight adjustment. But sometimes students need more than a slight adjustment. They need a complete overhaul, and that's okay. But again, try to keep it as close and as similar to what everyone else is doing as you can, as you consider the best adaptation for the student. And what we want to do is always protect their dignity. We never want to ever embarrass them, so we want to talk with them privately about how they're going to do their activity slightly differently. Or even when I would pass out, let's say, papers to students that they would be working on, I would always put at the bottom of my stack, if I had a paper that was maybe a modification, and I just would pass out, and then when I got to them, I just passed out a paper from the same stack from the bottom, and no one knew that they got a different paper. I know it's not always going to lend itself to being private, but it's nice if you can do that, and I will tell you, the students will truly appreciate it if you can do that. Well, that was our second checklist, and this third checklist I think you'll really like as new teacher candidates because it really spells everything out for you. Of course, the top, there's not much more I can tell you than what we've already talked about, but let's get to the performance objective and evaluation. So here we have, in orange, I have the objective, what will students know or be able to do as a result of this lesson, and the evaluation, you must be able to measure the demonstrated objective. And once you have those, you put them together in 1 to 2 sentences. So here is an example. Students will label the layers of the earth, there's your objective, with at least 80% accuracy. All right. And again, we wouldn't want 100% because we want to leave margin for error. A student could label and make a mistake and on one piece, but still have the majority of the concept a nice grasp on that. So we need to remember that. Another example, students will write transition words in a paragraph with a minimum of 3 sequence words. So a transition and a sequence word are the same. So that's just saying each sentence or each paragraph will need 3 sequence words. So that would be easy for a teacher to count and decide on that percentage and how they did. So that is measurable. Okay, if you have any questions about how to write these, I'm very happy to talk with you one-on-one. We could Zoom and talk about it. Next, we have our materials. We've talked about that. We talked about our anticipatory set. I'm going to give you a few more examples. We talked about the book on display. We talked about inquisitive question posed by the teacher at the beginning of the lesson, dressing in costume. Sometimes it might even be a science experiment set up, and the students are eager to find out what that's all about. And tying the information to prior knowledge. What did they just learn the day before? Sometimes just presenting that question of what did we learn yesterday, and then asking a question to go along with that will get them excited about what they're going to learn today if it was a lesson that they really enjoyed. It's always good to tie that prior knowledge every time you teach, if possible. There's something called neural reuse, and this is in brain research. And what it is that our brain has a pattern. It has a roadmap of information it already has stored. And if you can tie information to prior knowledge, then your brain can go right back to that same path it already knows, and it can then add the new information to build on that information, and they can gain that information more quickly using neural reuse. All right, moving on, we have our lesson introduction. And like I said before, get right to the point, keep it short and sweet. If you look back at your objective, what is it that you want them to be able to do by the end of the lesson? That is your introduction. Today we will learn how to identify the main character of a story. Boom. That's all you need. The teacher instruction, again, this is the long part. And like I said, I have this spelled out for you. This is where you script every word. You'll define the skill you will be teaching. So you will say, today we're learning how to identify main character. And main character is the person or animal most mentioned in the story. The main character has different thoughts and abilities and physical features. And this is where you want to go into detail explaining the definition of that particular skill and all there is to go with it. Any examples you can tie will be very important to bring in to help them. So for example, if I were in a story, you could say that I have brown hair, or you could say that I am a teacher. So there are different qualities, and giving examples is a great way to start stirring the minds of your students so they can start thinking, oh, I never thought about the career could be part of explaining the main character. You want to tie the concept for which they are already familiar, that background knowledge, the prior knowledge. So you might even say, do you remember yesterday when we were reading the story about such and such? And then you could say, well, that character had these qualities. And we can go beyond just the physical qualities of that we knew that the boy was tall and that he was good at basketball, but we also knew that he was nervous about the big game. So being nervous is one of his qualities. But then he was very brave when he went out and made that three-point shot in front of everyone. So bravery could be added to the list. So using prior knowledge is key. Go through any rules that apply to the skill and show examples you have found or prepared in advance. When you complete this area correctly, like I said, it's the longest part of the lesson plan. As you write out what you're going to say while teaching, be sure to insert what questions you plan to ask or prompts you plan to use. So I happen to have this book here, and I always like to put little Post-its in, or I might even write that on my lesson plan as well, what page number that maybe a question is on, or I might want to stress something. It's difficult to do on the spot because as you're teaching, keep in mind, not only are you teaching, but you're also monitoring your class. You're making sure everyone's paying attention. You're making sure that maybe a student who struggles in a certain area is getting all needs met. Maybe you're keeping an eye on the time because you might be getting close to lunch or something else. So you've got a lot going on. So the more you can help yourself, the better. And also, you don't want to just make this up on the fly. You'll have better questions if you think about them ahead of time. All right, a few examples of planning for questions and points you will make. Maybe you'll write page 1 is where you'd like to ask your students to make a prediction about the story based on the illustration. Page 4, you will ask your students, why do you think the main character packed an extra sandwich in her lunch? Would you have been willing to share your lunch with Marshall like she did? And page 5, you'll ask, or you'll remind yourself to be sure to stress the word never in paragraph 2. I will never eat vegetables, because you know later in the story something comes up about that they will need to know. So using the stress not only for their entertainment and their comprehension, but also as some foreshadowing. Again, be sure to use as many examples along the way and insert the examples you plan to use throughout your lesson when needed in your plan. So examples are critical, and think about how valuable, for example, for you on a resume, if you're writing a resume, having a sample resume to look at really helps you get to your point on your resume that much faster because you've got some ideas. All right, a few examples of how teachers can thoroughly explain using examples. So when you do this, take every opportunity you can to be clear. So if I have a Venn diagram, which are the two circles that overlap, it's a graphic organizer. Take a look at the Venn diagram I filled out comparing Cinderella and Smoky Mountain Rose. In the middle section, and point to this of the diagram, I wrote what the two characters have in common. Teachers will say listed items out loud. They have this, and this, and this, and this. Point to them as you go, because you may have a student who just zoned out for a second and then came back to you, and if you're pointing, that's helping. Or maybe they're having trouble hearing, and if you're pointing, that's helping. Being visual is very helpful. On the left side, I have shown how Cinderella is different than Rose. Point to this section on the left side and say the listed items out loud. And then, of course, on the right side, you would do the same and you would point as well. Another option could be at the beginning of Smoky Mountain Rose. The author describes Rose as kind, hardworking, and close to her father. These are examples of identifying character traits. Another example, if I were describing Principal Miller, I would say he is tall, funny, and he has a deep voice. So giving relatable examples all you can. All right, I'm taking all kinds of different concepts and just using them as examples for you so you can have a variety, because who knows what your topic will be when you put your lesson together, and the more options you have, the more of a base you'll have to draw from. And once again, this is the I do part of the gradual release of responsibility. And if you remember from before, the check for understanding is part of that teaching moment. So you've just taught it. Now, how are you going to make sure that they have it before they do this on their own? If they don't have it, you need to reteach. So the examples I have for you here are: the teacher will practice the new skill of using transition words with students by having a fun challenge. The student's job will be to give the teacher directions to follow using transition words. As the teacher attempts to put peanut butter on a cracker, each time a student has a turn, the student will have to use a new transition word in the directions, and the teacher will only do as told if the student gives a correct transition word. So every student will have a turn to give the teacher a direction, but they have to use a transition word to get the peanut butter onto the cracker. So it's kind of a fun way to make practicing the new skill come to life and demonstrate it. Another example would be students who just learned how to identify the different features that make up the setting of a story will read a different story with the teacher. Then the teacher will ask the students to work with their shoulder partner to identify as many features of the setting from the new story as they can. After 5 minutes, the teacher will call on different pairs of students to share what setting features they found. And they'll share these with the class and list them on the board. This will help the teacher determine if the students understand how to find all the features that make up the setting of a story before they try this on their own. And another example could be students who just learned about the layers of the earth will sing a song that depicts each of the layers of the earth. As the different layers are mentioned during the song, students will point to the layer being sung about at the time by pointing to a big poster at the front of the room. This will help the teacher determine if the students know the different layers and are ready to complete a review on their own. And finally, students who just learned how to subtract double digits with borrowing will be asked to complete problems on a dry erase board at their desk and then hold it up for the teacher to see when they have their answer. Then the teacher will work the problem on the board and talk it out and talk about how the problem was successfully completed. Once the teacher has completed 6 to 10 examples, the teacher will know if the students are ready to complete this on their own or if a reteach of the lesson is necessary. So we did this together, and finally we're ready for our application where they apply what they just learned and they have independent practice. They can do this all on their own or with a partner or maybe as a team. So how will the students practice the skill? It can be accomplished in writing, it can happen orally or physically. So some examples. Students who just learned about transition words will write a how to blow a bubble paper where they are asked to include 6 transition words in their directions. Now keep in mind, 6 transition words is measurable. Students who just learned how to identify the different features that make up the setting of a story will read a different story and identify a minimum of 6 features of the setting in the new story. Students who just learned about the layers of the earth will make a model of the cross-section of the earth. The model will be made of clay or Play-Doh, and the students will label the different layers using toothpicks and paper labels. And finally, students who just learned how to subtract double digits with borrowing will complete 15 problems on their own. Okay, so I think you've got the idea. Of course, in each of these sections, you'll want to put more detail than what I have put, but I'm giving you a general idea so when you are doing this, you can be on the right track as you start getting your footing with this. And this was the you do section. Of course, with the closure, this is where we have that recap. You restate that introduction one more time. Today we learned how to add transition words to our writing. Transition words like first, next, then, and finally help our writing flow and make more sense. Next time you write a report or write in your journal, try adding transition words. So remember, we told them what they just learned, we gave a little bit more of the meat to it, and then we reminded them to use it again. We invited them to use the skill again. And finally, that differentiation, that is just once you write that lesson, you want to make sure you make those modifications for your students. And I have some examples below. I mentioned the broken wrist earlier, so I'll use the next. Bashara will use a shorter version of the story in his activity. Ellen will have a word bank to help her complete the assignment. So this is as if the rest of the class perhaps didn't need the word bank. Ellen may need it and need that word bank to assist her. Julia will only write 3 transition words to the new sentences rather than writing 6 new words. So these are just a few suggestions, and I hope that this checklist gives you some confidence as you write lesson plans. All right, that concludes this. Thank you very much.